Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about literary analysis. And this is the first of what will be many conversations on this topic, because literary analysis is going to be one of the chief means by which we understand the text that we will be reading, and also through that, our wider investigation of the relationship between our texts, that is, our reading materials, um, and the topics of health, illness, and medicine, and so on and so forth. So what is literary analysis? Literary analysis is an umbrella term that we use in English studies to describe the evidence that we use and the way that we understand a given text. Now, unlike scientific fields, English scholars rely on what's called qualitative data. That's the form of quotations, theory, and/or historical or cultural information. And we use these to arrive at precise and deep understandings of our reading materials. The purpose of literary analysis is to read and understand our textual materials, that is, our weekly readings, by breaking them down into their component elements, and then thinking about how these parts inform both the work as a whole and also the way in which that work influences the wider world. In particular, we seek to understand how the deeper meaning of a text intersects with the way it's been written, that is, the craft of its writing. And this is what I mean. In any text, we can think about it on two different levels. One is what we call denotation. And that by denotation, I mean what the text says on the surface. In a nutshell, it's story. But in addition to that, there's something called connotation. That's a deeper level. And that really is what a text says between the lines. Now, when we're reading, we want to obviously understand what a text means on the denotative level. But when we're analyzing, we really want to look at that connotative level. We're really interested in what that text in some ways is saying between the lines. And we can do that by examining the text in three different ways. We can do it through something called close reading. We can examine it through theory. That is, we can read an outside theoretical work and use it as a kind of lens to understand the text. Or we can use historical or cultural information. And we would do that in the exact same way. We would use historical phenomenon that surrounded a text and then see the way in which that would have influenced what the text is trying to say. Now, we'll be looking at theory and historical or cultural information a little bit later on this semester. For this week, I want us to focus on what it means to closely read something. So what is close reading? Well, close reading is a way of reading a text to understand precisely and deeply what it means. Now, you do it when you focus on how a passage manages to say the things it wants to say without saying them directly. Put another way, it's where you focus on how a passage uses language to say the things that it wants to say, in particular to connote things. So we have some tools for close reading, and these are largely tools that we would use to assess the way in which the language of the text has been put together. And sometimes we might call that the way the rhetoric of the text is working. Rhetoric is a fancy word for language or for writing. So I'm going to go through some of these tools. These are parts of an author's craft, that is, the kinds of strategies that the author can use when trying to make the point or tell the story the author wants to make. So some of the things that we can look at when we're closely reading a text are things like tone or voice. In particular, the difference between the narrator's voice and the voices of the characters, but also more generally, the kind of feeling that the text evinces and why that might be. We can look at metaphors, similes, or images. A metaphor is a way of describing a phenomenon by using a different example. A simile is where you compare an idea to something else. And an image, obviously, is where you create a kind of visual image of something going on. We can look at the dialogue versus the description of the text. Dialogue occurs in a text when two characters are talking to one another. Description occurs when the narrator is telling you, the reader, something. And what we can do is see, if there's a difference between the dialogue and the description that we're seeing in the text. Is there a difference in meaning? Is there a difference in tone? We can similarly look at the structure of the text. Literary texts, like novels, poetry, even essays, are made up of different component pieces. So one of the things we can do is we can examine how those pieces have been put together, how they fit together like a puzzle. We can also look for repetitions within a given text, and that could be repetitions of words, phrases, sentences, ideas, etc. And what you can do is examine those repetitions and see if there's a pattern that you're seeing over time and what that pattern means. And the final idea on the left-hand side is ambiguities. Ambiguities would be moments within a given text where the text seems to be deliberately puzzling or withholding meaning, or where the author seems to be using key words in more than one way and asking us to understand a given term from sort of two different angles. Now, we also have another set of tools. This list continues on the right-hand side. We can look at conventions or traditions within a text. When authors write, they don't write in a vacuum. They're writing in and against established conventions. Those could be generic conventions, writing conventions, various traditions. I'll give you an example. If you're reading a text and it opens with the line, "Once upon a time," you probably know that the text is either a fairy tale or that the text is referencing a fairy tale. And the reason why is that it's a linguistic convention for fairy tales to open with "once upon a time." All right, another tool we can use is syntax. Syntax is a fancy way of saying grammar. And things that you can examine when you're looking at a text are questions like, does the author use long or short sentences? Does he vary his sentence lengths, or does he repeat similarly long or similarly short sentences? Does the author use sentences with really long openings where you can't really tell where the subject is? Does the author deliberately break grammatical rules? In addition, you can also look at diction. Diction is another fancy term. It means word choice. When authors write, they have an innumerable choice of words that they can draw on. So one of the things you can look for is whether the author uses or repeats words or synonyms for words. Does the author use really complicated words, that is, words that are polysyllabic, or words that refer to extremely complex terminology or ideas? Or does the author deliberately use simple words, monosyllabic words, or words that refer to easily understood terminology? And since we're studying medical literature, the other thing you can examine is whether the author is using abbreviations, are they using acronyms, or are they using slang terms? And then the final element that you can look at is visual images. We know that some texts are illustrated and some texts are not. So one of the things you can ask yourself is, is this book or is this poem illustrated? If so, are the illustrations in color or are they in black and white? And what's their relationship to the written text? Do these pictures illustrate a specific point the text is making? Do they kind of fill in the blanks? Do they fill in a detail that the text has not provided? Or are they actually meant to contradict the text, to suggest a different reading? Okay, so here's some of your tools. Now you might be asking yourself, this is all well and good, but how exactly do I closely read? So here's some steps. First of all, don't read on the computer. If you're given a PDF, I want you to print it out and read it on paper. The reason why is you tend to read more deeply when you're reading things on paper. It also gives you the chance to annotate your text, that is, to highlight it, make notes in the margins, underline, circle, etc. And that's the second piece of advice. When you're reading, read with a pen or a pencil in hand so that you can underline, circle, or otherwise note things that seem really important to you. Finally, thirdly, I should say, read carefully. I want you to look for a few things when you're reading. One is really just passages, sentences, or phrases that seem to explode with meaning. This could mean they encapsulate a central idea. It could be because it is particularly beautiful or noteworthy, either musically or imagistically. Or it might just be that it kind of speaks to you. The hairs on the back of your neck seem to stand on end, or you have a really strong emotional response to it. That can be an excellent starting point to begin to ask yourself questions about the text. The other thing you can read carefully for are patterns of ideas or of language that seem particularly important. Or places where the text seems to be asking you to read words or ideas in more than one way. So once you've read for and noted those things down, what you then are going to go do is go back through using your close reading tools to understand what the text is connoting and how it is connoting it. So I'm going to give you an example. This should be, for those of you that are Harry Potter fans, a pretty familiar passage. I'll read it. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you would expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just don't hold with such nonsense. You Harry Potter fans will know that that's the opening paragraph to Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Now, I can closely read this paragraph, and I'll show you how. First of all, as a reminder, we know that there's 2 levels on which this text operates. There's the level of denotation. That's just what the text is saying, what's going on a very kind of shallow level. And if you look at the quote, it's really telling us that Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, are trying to tell us that they're normal people. That's it. But the more important element, or the more interesting element, is the connotative level. That is what the author wants you to know that is occurring between the lines of this passage, what the author is not saying, but wants you to walk away knowing nonetheless. Now, we can examine that by using our close reading tools. So I've already selected this passage as being one that really explodes with meaning for me. Now I want to use my close reading tools to understand why. And as a reminder, those tools on the left-hand side are tone or voice, metaphors, similes, or images, dialogue versus description, structures, repetitions, ambiguities, stylistic, linguistic, or structural conventions, syntax, diction, or visual images. Now, when you're doing this the first few times, you might find it helpful to go through this list entirely. That's actually what I did with this paragraph. What I ultimately decided to do was to select out a few of these tools that I felt like would work really well for understanding this passage. Those are tone or voice, dialogue or description, ambiguities, and diction. And I'll show you what I mean. By tone or voice, I'm really thinking about that relationship between what the narrator is saying and what the characters are saying. Because this is a passage by the narrator. The narrator is actually offering us a description, but embedded within that is that the narrator is repeating to us either something that the Dursleys have told the narrator or something the Dursleys are likely to say, which is the Dursleys were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much, right? We can imagine the Dursleys saying that kind of a phrase, thank you very much. So what's interesting in this passage is that the narrator appears to be what we would call an omniscient narrator. The narrator is inside the head of the Dursleys at the exact same time that she is also describing the Dursleys to us. And there's a way in which this passage overall kind of has a satiric tone to it, right? It seems to be almost joking in some ways. And it strikes me that one of the things that this narrator wants us to understand is that the Dursleys are, sort of priggish, sort of prim. As you go on, you'll discover that they're pretty close-minded, right? In this case, they seem to be overly concerned with their quote-unquote normalness. And we know this because they say that because the narrator describes that they're perfectly normal, and then she repeats it, that they're the last people that you would expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious. And then a third repetition of this idea. The reason why we wouldn't expect that is because they just don't hold with such nonsense. And again, the idea of nonsense is probably a word that Dursleys would use. I want to think about ambiguities, though, because it strikes me that there's a couple of things going on in this passage which is a little bit odd. First of all, this is a book that's titled Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. But this is the first line of that book. This is a book that opens not with a discussion of the main character, but with a discussion of the character's relatives. And one of the things we can ask ourselves is, why does Harry Potter open in that way? Right? What is the author suggesting to us about Harry, about the world that he comes from, about the ideas that she wants us to explore? But there's another ambiguity as well, and that's the word normal, because I'm not really sure what the Dursleys mean by normal. And that seems to be a point that this passage is actually raising. It's saying to us what is normal? Well, the Dursleys are defining it as people that are not involved as anything strange or mysterious. And that it somehow is antithetical to the idea of, let's say, nonsense. Well, why are they doing that? And it might relate to the fact that if you think about Harry Potter, one of the things the work explores is how we imagine normalcy versus non-normalcy. And then finally, we could look at diction in this passage. In particular, that what you end up with are these little extraneous phrases like thank you very much, nonsense, that they seem to provide a kind of extra textual meaning to suggest that the Dursleys are speaking through the narrator, that they're being very conversational, and the effect of it is to be pretty humorous, actually. All right, so those are the kinds of ways in which you can use these tools in order to begin to closely read. You can understand how it is that this passage seems to be important. To me, it's how this passage raises questions about the book and how this passage tends to be satiric. What I'd like for you to do now is I want you to turn to Quinault, who is the author who we're going to be reading for this week. I've given you some short selections. Basically, what this author did was he came up with a very short, somewhat mundane story, and he rewrote it like 120 to 150 times using different styles of writing. And what I'm going to be asking you to do in the discussion is to pick two of those stories, that is two of those repetitions, and to examine the differences between them. And I would use our close reading tools in order to do that. All right, please let me know if you have any questions, and I will look forward to talking with you in the discussion board and then also next week. Thank you very much.